Hello, welcome to Groundwork, a podcast from McClanahan Corporation to talk about key material processing topics. From agricultural to mining to material recycling, we'll discuss the best ways to produce raw materials that power the world, because if it's not grown, it's mined. My name is Renee Schrift, and I've been with McClanahan for approximately 25 years, working with dairies and our team on providing solutions for recycling sand, recovering sand, and just all around enhancing bedding quality. We wanted to present a podcast to you today comparing new sand and recycled sand for dairy cow bedding. It's kind of been a hot topic as far as recycling sand and all the benefits to recycled sand versus new sand, and when we put the sand back under the cows, and then how we manage that. We've been talking a lot about that lately in a lot of our articles and in our webinars. And so we wanted to bring a podcast to you and just kind of hone in and talk about some of these key topics and how to manage. So with me today is Dr. Reid. I'm very excited to have him join us today in this podcast. And so I'll have Dr. Reid introduce himself, and then we'll kick things off.
It's good to be here and, to talk about things that are really important for cows. So I'm a veterinarian. I graduated a long time ago, 1973, 15 years of general dairy practice, very little small animal practice. Then I started my own consulting business, basically looking at milk quality, which leads to all the things that are important to bring clean, calm cows to the parlor or the milking barn. And done that for 15 years or so. Did go to work for Womatic for about 8.5 years. And then back to independent consulting. And people go, when you're going to retire, Reid? And I'm like, I don't really retire. I just have fun. I get to go to dairies and I get to do things like this. And some of the things when we teach milking equipment analysis, I always try to tell people in classes through the NMC and that I've made every mistake you could possibly make. And my goal is to have some other people not make as many mistakes as I did over the years. So, and this is a great topic because cow comfort and how it impacts the profitability of a dairy and in the productivity that and the attitude of the people in the parlor. So it's really important. So.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And so thank you again for joining us. When working with you, and our team has worked with you, and even just going on dairies with you, you're such a visual. So there's so many things visually that you pick up and you see, and we talk about it and we dissect it. And I think that's really important. So sand bedding, McClanahan has always strived and pushed to have solutions out there from the recyclability standpoint, getting the sand out of the manure stream, and doing a very good job at doing that. And we have a lot of experience with that on all different types of manure streams coming into those manure systems. But then once we get the sand out, do the dairy producers feel comfortable putting that recycled sand back under the cow, or are they going to buy new? We have very few dairy producers that will buy new. If they do buy new, just to purposely put it under a group of cows, that they'll do that. But generally what we try to do is get that sand to be as dry and clean as possible and looking like new sand to go back under the cow.
The overall look in the industry is that sand is probably the optimal bedding. So it's forgiving. It molds to the cow. It's inorganic, so that unless it has organic material in it, it doesn't grow bacteria very well. The other thing that I think a lot of people just don't think about is that if your sand is properly maintained in the beds, then you actually clean feet and in between the toes in particular, and you tend to have less wart situations, both heel warts and true warts on cows, so that our overall hoof health is better. There's excellent traction in most of the sand barns. So these cows, as they're moving, especially as we get into larger and larger group sizes and pens on some of these newer dairies. So the sand is very forgiving from that point of view. On the other side of that, people go, well, it's not very forgiving on some of my equipment. And that's true. But when we're thinking about the dairy business or as I always tell people, when you build a barn, why do you build a barn? It's for the cows. And so if you think about ways to make it as good as you can for the cows, then sand obviously comes to the top. Not saying you can't use other beddings, but sand really does offer some tremendous advantages for cows. And we know that if we increase the lying time by 1 hour per day, past 10 hours, there's a significant improvement in milk production. Uh, and so when we look at dairies in the real world, as I call it, very rarely do we find dairies that are one stall for one cow. Typically, there's overcrowding going on. And what we find is that when we have comfortable bedding, cows will get up and go back to eat. Other cows could use that space. And if you don't have that really good cow comfort where cows are willing to get up and go back to eat, then it does really begin to impact you at some level of overcrowding. So a sand barn overcrowded is way better than organic bedded barn overcrowded. So, a lot of advantages.
A lot of advantages. Speaking of overcrowding, there's just visiting a lot of farms and even overseas here lately. What do you think is a little off topic of this, just specifically sand, but where do you think overcrowding averages really are today? I'm just curious what you're seeing, and I'm looking at a lot of farms that are 50%. That number 50% is chiming up all the time. Where do you see that?
Well, I think a lot of areas are between 30 and 50% over. And you're probably right. You're seeing a trend of that. And unfortunately, people look at a spreadsheet and they look at dollars and they look at milk and volume and the dollars at the end of the day or the end of the month or however they want to figure it. They can say, well, I might sacrifice some production, but I've got more milk to sell at the end of the day or the end of the month or whatever their counting period is. But on the other hand, you're not maximizing your potential per cow. And I understand that. But you also have to look at that if you have more mastitis when that happens, then we're definitely going to impact not only the cost of that, but the repro effect of the mastitis. So there's, if you manage things really well and you can keep your cows relatively clean and you have good, consistent udder preparation processes, then people can get by. But from my perspective, once you're past probably 115% or somewhere in that range, it's probably going to start to have some negative impacts. Although really good dairy managers will tell you, Reid, you're wrong. I can manage it at higher levels. So
I think then coming back to that stall and how that stall is being used, probably a little bit more, or they're maybe fighting for some stall space, maybe some bunk space, things like that. And you talk about the sand and the traction, which I think is very important, and it gives them just more comfort. It gives you as a producer more comfort that everything's going to be okay there. But what do you see? I mean, we don't talk about it a lot. What do you see about the stall management itself? Like, I look at it as like, well, if you're going to overcrowd by 50%, let's say your number's 50, rough there and in there, then what is your bedding practices changing? Are you still every 5 days? Or are you every 3 days or 4 days? Like, I would say if you're overcrowding, or if you're not overcrowding by very much, you probably could get away with that maybe once a week type of deal. But if you're overcrowding, what do you kind of see the more aggressive stall management being today when you're at those numbers?
So if you look at published research that talks about sand usage, somewhere in that 50 pounds per stall per day. Well, if you overcrowd, it's going to go up because there's more cows in and out of that stall. So you're going to create some issues there. And I always tell dairymen, this is one of those what do you see kinds of things. So I said to the dairymen, if you bed every 5 days, what do your cows do when they come back to the freestall barn after milking when fresh sand has been applied to the stalls or new sand? And they look at you kind of funny. And I'm like, they're going to lay down quicker. They are, because that sand is more comfortable. It's softer, which then leads to the next thing is that if you're not digging that sand and turning it and keeping it soft so it's not compacted under the cows and you overcrowd, now you're going to be in real trouble. So if you're using sand, in all honesty, I tell every dairyman that I know that uses sand that they need to be digging that sand at least on a daily basis. So digging and leveling. And what I want to see is I want to see when a cow walks up into that stall, I want to see it go to the dew claws or deeper into the sand. So that tells me the sand is soft and we're going to optimize the cow comfort when that cow goes and lays down in that stall. And the other thing about that is that we all know that in a sand stall, we're going to find that a black line that develops at some point below the surface of the stall. When you dig these to a depth of 6 to 7 inches every day, that black line is below that. So that means that the toes of the cow typically don't even get to that black line. We've kept the sand soft enough, the organic material is moving through, and we can have stalls where we don't have to dig them out near as often, which is very labor intensive. And it's tough to do when you have, especially if you're overcrowded in a barn. So we can get to not having to dig the stalls out completely in the back 2 to 3 feet, which allows us to have more comfortable cows and overall less labor simply by running a device through to dig the stalls.
Yeah, and that digging and that tilling, or moving the sand, not just digging and putting a line through it, but that kind of like that till that we talk about a lot of the time, that helps that aeration piece too. So we're also getting some air entrainment back into that stall. If that's helping keep the sand looser and a little drier potentially, or just moving it one more time. And I think that helps too, just like that whole aeration piece. And then, like you said, that level of where a lot of things are draining down through the stall, it ends up being lower in your stall where you want it. You don't want it up where she's going to move the sand out and it's like just right there within an inch underneath the loose sand in the stall.
Right. And there's been some work done at Wisconsin and other places too that talk about, how cows actually get up and how the sand actually cushions the sole and allows them to get traction. And when you have good soft sand, you really have optimal cow comfort. I mean, that's the bottom line. It needs to be soft. If I walk into a barn and the guy's like, well, I have sand bedding and, I don't know why I have all these problems that I do. And I walk in and I see that there's very little of the hooves that will actually penetrate into the sand where it's packed, then we're really missing the real advantage of the sand bedding, which is the cushioning effect that can mold to the body of the cow. And if you're not going to dig those stalls, it can be a nasty kind of a thing. You think, well, I got sand, so it's not a problem. No, you don't have comfortable sand. It needs to be soft enough that the cow can be comfortable and molded to her body. So.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. So you talked a little bit and mentioned about a little bit about this 50 pounds per cow per day. That's a number that we've used obviously for years, and we use it not only because that's what we tell producers that they need to be putting back in the stall, but we're doing it because on the back end when we're looking at manure and what would potentially come into a system. And when you have a recovery system that you're trying to separate the sand and we're trying to figure out recovery rates and how to size things and capacities, that's when we're really starting. And even these sand dryers today, and drying the sand down, we're trying to look at how much sand is actually going to be received into a system like that. So we go back and forth, and it's not a real good known number. We say 50 pounds. That's what textbooks say. That's what we've been using for years. But I think that as these cows and things have transitioned and lots of improvements in facility design, just even the cow size, sheer size, the overcrowding, and that whole housing and air and ventilation, and how that's really given us a good way to increase on these numbers and overcrowding. I think ventilation probably helps us a lot too in some of these facilities and the way the enhancements have been pushed out there in the industry. But the numbers that we're seeing, like if you're going back in with recycled sand, it might be a shy less, but I mean, we're seeing numbers like more in the 60 pound per cow per day usage, maybe even a little bit pushed a little higher on really dry sand that's going back in the stalls, because it just moves so much more freely with the cows, and there's not that moisture to those surfaces that kind of hold it in place a little bit, but it still allows it to be cushion the cow, conform to the cow, move when she puts her foot in there and her hoof in there and it moves with her. It lets her sink in. The moisture content of those sands still allow that. But if we're going in with really dry sand, like let's say 2% moisture content, and it's just like moving, it doesn't stack, we really see those numbers push up higher because they're just moving it out quicker. you put it in, and then it just moves back out with the cows. So I don't think that 50 cow per pounds per cow per day anymore, really, on even recycled sand or aggressive sand management, is probably the average number, I'll say.
I would agree. And I think that, as I said, as we get more overcrowding, we're going to see cows that they enter and leave stalls quicker than they do when there's not overcrowding. And you just got to go watch cows, and if you look at a barn that's not overcrowded, you're going to see cows walking around and they're looking around at their buddies, and are they going to the stalls? And then they kind of walk up, get to the curb, walk up in. They do that very slowly. You go to an overcrowded barn and you watch with the speed at which cows go into stalls. It's markedly different. And the other thing is that oftentimes in those overcrowded situations, you'll get another cow standing, close wanting a stall. And as a cow starts to move to get up, somebody's bumping on her, another cow, and she gets out of that stall quicker. And that means you're going to have more sand pulled out of that bed than you would if you weren't overcrowded. And people say, well, how do you know that, Reid? I just look at cows. Look at the behavior
because she's a little bit more rushed to get out, or something's forcing her to get up and get out. Where even when you're pushing cows, trying to get the group to the parlor and they're laying down, so you're just trying to move them, and they do jerk up a little bit differently and move out because it's not on their time, it's on your time or another cow's time. So,
right, and the other thing to tell you too is that oftentimes you don't see this as much in sand barns, but when you have to get up a lot of cows to bring them to the parlor, it tells you your bed's uncomfortable. So if you have sand stalls and you have to get a lot of cows up, I can almost tell you that if you look, you're not going to see the hooves are just barely into the sand at all because it's not comfortable.
Okay, so you're saying that if you are walking through a barn and you're walking behind a pusher and there are a lot of cows lying down, it might tend to be because they're maybe not resting as well, or because the stall isn't as comfortable?
Well, if it's not as comfortable as it should be, they take longer to lay down. Therefore, when you come to get them up, they're like, I've only been laying here for whatever. I don't want to get up. It's true. You can see that on barns. I have dairies that when I've challenged the owners to do that walkthrough through the facility, and what do you see? And do it when you have new sand put in on day one, and do it on day 4.5 or 5, right before you're going to rebed the barn, and see if there's different behavior in your cows. And it's definitely different behavior. You're going to find that there's more cows have to be asked to get up at that 4.5 or 5 days than they will on new sand. I mean, it just happens. And so when you think about that, this is why this maintenance of the barn and doing the right things with your sand is going to optimize your production. So.
Yeah, no, I never thought of that. And you're right. The cows are fighting for some lying time and some space. So there's always probably someone knocking on the back door of the stall saying, "Hey, I need my time." So
and they see a cow starting to get up, another cow's going to be right there pushing on her, and so you just increase the intensity with which they move out of the stall, which is going to pull more sand out. Whether it's really dry, as you said, or it has a little higher moisture level, they're still going to pull way more sand out of that stall when they're hurried. Just watch cows. If you go get cows up, watch the sand come out. If they get up on their own without anybody being around them, you're not going to see as much sand pulled into the alleys.
Right. So. That's interesting. That's and we're not even touching on stall design today. I don't think we have enough time to do that. But like even just stall design, I know that can hinder just the width of it, the length of it, all those types of things can impact some of these other topics this other topic that we're going to talk about, as far as just like new sand versus recycled sand, and just what you see and the impacts. I'm sure a lot of it kind of goes hand in hand because it goes back to this management piece, but we'll dive a little bit more into that. But just even stall design and all of that, that's probably a whole nother podcast at some point, just to talk about that. So let's just talk a little bit more about new sand versus recycled sand. We know dairymen have a lot of choices out there. It seems like when talking to our customers, And dairy producers that are either recycling sand or not, they could have a Clanahan system, they could have a sand lane system or a passive system. It doesn't really matter, but we always like to find out, like, where do you buy your sand? Why do you buy the sand that you purchase to put back under your cows? A lot of times it all comes back down to proximity, and it's just locale. It's quick and easy to get it. It's only 10 miles down the road, or I have my own pit, or it's just close to the dairy. So it keeps the cost down, because we all are, looking at that and the inputs coming in, and what are you recovering if you're recovering, and what if you're not. And so you're buying new sand in all the time. So a lot of times it comes down to location, and then the cost point too, as far as getting that sand to the farm, and how much they need, and how quickly they can get it. If they need it on demand, they're going to rely on the local guy that can just bring the truck that morning, and they have sand to put under their cows that day because they need to bed their stalls. And new sand can be, really fine. It can be coarser. It could be a concrete sand, a wash sand. It could be a manufactured sand. Lots of different options out there. And then we have the recycled sand. And obviously recycled sand, whether it's a sand lane or whatever system, a Clanahan system, whatever system it is, we're always looking for a specific characteristic of sand, sand that's going to work with the cows and not be detrimental to any, like, hooves or anything like that, and injuring her, so she can get back and forth to the parlor and be comfortable, but also separates well. Because if you're going to go to the extent of investing on your facility to put in these systems, just like you do on a parlor, the same thing, you want to make sure you have the right inputs, and you're going to get the best return for your investment. So, choosing that sand type on a recycling system is important as well, as far as particle size, and how it's going to settle and work its way through manure streams or water that's, not clean. It's usually recycled. So how do we, what sand do we use for that? But when we look at new sand, in your perspective, new sand versus recycled, and I know what the recycled sand obviously looks like going back into the cow, but on new sand, what do you see if they're not recycling at all? I'm just curious. What kind of sand types are people gravitating to when they're not recycling sand and they're always buying new?
So I think they're going to look for stuff that's the particle size is a little larger. If they go to the really fine sands, typically they get more packed in the stalls, especially if they're not digging them on a regular basis. So they can have some real issues with that. So you got to be careful that because if you get some urine in it, some of these sands will actually almost turn to concrete in the stalls if you're not digging them. So that to me is the biggest issue. And then we don't get as much traction off of that kind of sand either when it gets into the alleyways. But on the other hand, you don't want it too coarse or too sharp where it causes excessive wear on the hooves. So I would say that the biggest issue I see on a lot of new sand is too fine, and it packs more.
And then in the stall, like, do you see, I mean, if they're going to be successful with that fine sand, obviously, like we talked about before, they're probably going to be, even with new sand, they're probably going to be tilling that sand or moving that sand around in the stall on a daily basis, hopefully.
I think I tell everybody, you have a digger, get it. If you have sand, have a digger.
If you have sand, have a digger. That's our conclusion. No, just kidding.
Well, I've said that for a long time, and
Right.
I've watched it in I actually got in the business of trying to make one, and it works really well. But my welder neighbor got to be more of a farmer, and it's gone. But to me, the impact on the lying time of cows when you dig them more than outweighs the cost that a guy would say of diesel for his bobcat, or wear and tear on his bobcat, or wear and tear on the digger.
Yeah.
They go, well, you wear out the tines, put new tines on.
Right.
What we're saying is that this cow comfort ultimately drives your profitability. So, what's it worth to you for your overall dairy operation?
Now, on recycled sand, we'll come back to that new sand topic in just a second. But on recycled sand, what do you see more success because we're washing the fines out, or do you see what are you seeing even on recycled sand? I guess let me ask you this question. When you walk through a facility that's on sand, can you tell right away whether you obviously could tell if it's new sand or recycled sand?
Yes.
Okay.
And you can look at it because what you find is that your recycled sand will be much more uniform. And from most cases, it's going to be way more uniform grain size than new sand. Virgin sand almost always has a little different appearance first. It's usually a little lighter in color. And it's also got a wider range of particle size. Whereas if it's been recycled for a period of time in a dairy, it's going to be much more uniform.
Mm-hmm.
So,
And what are your thoughts on recycled sand, just in general? Like, I'm sure there's some out there that we see that maybe shouldn't be going back in the stall as soon as quickly as some people turn it around. But and for some strange reason, some people have a lot of success no matter what they do, and there's others that don't, and it becomes, I've been on dairies where there's actually, little signs that anyone's moving sand around, they have 10 piles, and every pile is labeled with a week that they moved it into that windrow. And so it comes down to, you have to use it on week 10 and not week 2. And so there's all these different management practices, but I guess in your mind, like, what's your opinion of the recycled sand going back in, and what do you see with that and challenges?
well, the challenge sometimes is that if it's not allowed to weep long enough, once you pile it back up, then when it's weeping good, you're going to take some of the organic matter and it's going down to the bottom of that pile. Whatever you didn't get separated is going to go down. So that lower stuff is going to have more moisture, more organic matter. So the dairies that are successful with relatively wet sand going back in pile it fairly tall and only skim the top off, and they repile and repile. And so they've learned what I've just said, is that there's going to be less organic matter in it, and therefore it's going to be better from their overall herd health from the mastitis point of view if they do that. So you're right. There's a trick to getting it as dry as you can, but there's going to be times of the year in many dairies where we're putting in wetter sand they really wanted to, just because if it's not covered, if it's out, or just that there's a huge rainstorm going on when they're bringing sand back into the barn. You look at those covered wagons and they're driving, half a mile outside and it's pouring rain. They're going to put wet sand in. And so the wet in itself isn't the end of it. I mean, think about it. The bacteria need three things to grow. They need a food product, they need heat, and they need moisture. And the only thing we can control is the moisture, because they're going to track manure in there and they're going to heat it when they lay down. So we're going to have that growth. So we know that it's like everything else on a dairy. It's like, can you get your sand as dry as possible for most days when you bed it back in the barn, knowing that there's probably going to be a few times where it's too wet to go in there, or wetter than you wanted it to when you put it in there. But ideally is that what's that level that you've decided is going to work on your facility? And that's going to relate some to the quality of the sand, the coarseness of it and that sort of thing. That's going to drain and weep better than some of your really fine sands. So.
Exactly. Okay. As far as just even the recycled sand, do you see dairy producers having to, I mean, obviously they need, if they're tilling it and they have a digger, then it's going to work a little bit better for them and they're going to be able to keep more control of that. But we know it's recycled. We know there's a level of organics going there. There's a level of organics going in with new sand too. And I think that comes back to the packing, and when it gets wet and it has a lot of surface areas, so it can pack together. It depends on that organic matter that's in there. And we've done some tests where we've seen some new sand come in that is actually higher organics, not the manure organics and the fiber organics, but organics that are more like soils, clays, just not things that are not inert. And so then you classify those as, organics. And when we talk about organics generally in recycled sand, we're talking more about the manure fiber, because we're recycling. So where's it going to come from? It's going to come from the manure side of it, and what's leaching from the piles and the water we're using to recover sand. But do you see more of this overall stall clean out happen more on a regular basis? on new sand or recycled sand, or is it just a combination of both?
Combination of both. And you've seen me do it on dairies. I call it the vet test, where I'm reaching into the bed and I'm smelling it. I mean, what does it smell like? And I do that on the surface and very shallow. And then I dig down toward that black line. And okay, what's the difference as I get down towards that black line? And you can get that nasty smell. And it's going to tell you that I don't need to run a bacterial count on that sand because I kind of know what it's going to be. So I think that's a very simple procedure. Just what does it smell like? And if it starts to smell like a sewer, you are in trouble, or you're going to be in trouble if you don't fix it. So how often do you dig it or remove that back couple of feet, 2.5 to 3 feet of sand? It's going to depend on if you're digging that stall on a regular basis, 6 to 7 inches deep, you're not going to have to do it very often. There's a barn out by me. It's a 200 cow freestall barn. And we did some testing with the digger that I was having made. And the third prototype we brought out there, he said, "You're not taking it back. I'm keeping it this time." And that's been probably about 8 years, and they've never dug the sand out of that barn. And I'll guarantee you can get all the way to your wrist by just flaking your hand into that sand. It's that soft. And it's got a black line, but it's so far down that it never touches the toes of the cows. So his point was that he saw the difference in two things. He saw the difference in lying time and milk production, and he saw the difference in lowered somatic cell counts when he started digging. Because when we dug that barn the first time, it was really hard. It was new sand that was packed, and it's worked really well for it. So I'm convinced that if you drive that black line down, then and you're using the veterinary test to what does it smell like, you can get a good idea when you need to dig that stall out. Okay.
Yeah, it's like check the sheets, you need to make sure that they're clean. So, I think that you want them clean anyway. So you want it clean and decent for your cows to lie down. I mean, that's where that critical part of the cow is going to be lying too. And like you said, if her hooves are going in there and it's hitting an area and pulling material back up, that's going to end up right there where you don't really want it, I think, in the back of that stall, or at least expose her to that. And that's not good. So I think we've covered a lot here. I think the thing that highlights to me, and I'm glad that we talked a little bit about the overcrowding thing, because it just seems like it's coming up more and more and more in conversation, and the numbers are just, it's okay to put the 50% number out there. I wasn't really thinking about it until a couple of months ago that how is that impacting, stall usage? Obviously it does. And, overall sand usage, it will. Cows getting in and out of stalls, maybe the little rush factor sometimes, depending on the animals, the cows you have. I mean, like you're saying, like even just kind of, cows nudging each other to try to get up and to lie down because that's just what she needs to do. And she wants to. She's, after she eats, she wants to go and lie down and make milk. And I think that, just thinking about that a little bit more, just, that's good information to have, that your sand usage potentially is going to go up. And therefore, if they're kicking more sand out, then maybe we really need to assess how we're digging the stalls and make sure that we do implement that every day. And I think that then even that comes back to adding new sand to stalls, and you might need to check that schedule, because if you're creeping up there on cow numbers in the same facilities and stretching those limits, then maybe you also need to analyze how more frequently you're putting new sand or recycled sand back in those stalls and refilling. So.
Well, that's my point exactly. And the only way you know that, and this is where dairymen have a tough time, or a lot of dairymen do, that is to spend a little time walking around the facility on a very regular basis and realize that it's not waste your time. You're actually observing what do I see in my facility? And on the other hand is, what are my cows trying to tell me? I mean, if you really stand back and watch what's going on, you will see different behaviors when sand levels get down lower. And you'll see differences in stall usage. And you'll also see what I'm saying. If you're overcrowded, you're going to watch how these cows interact and how much quicker they're moving out of those stalls. And that's going to, like you said, it's going to increase the sand displacement out of that stall. So
Yes, displacement. That's the right, not in the stall, but displaced back into the alley with the manure. So yeah, and even in these manure systems, you need to account for that too, because if you're, just it's going to be potentially more sand. It's going to be more sand going through a system potentially, and then you're going to need to add more sand back into a stall. So the whole big picture, and you're right, you have to take the time to be out there and to look at it.
right, and another one that I really look at, and you've seen me do it, is I look at right at the curb. Is there a buildup of organic material? If you're using a lot more sand, then that sand is wearing on the whatever device they're using, even a rubber tire scraper or a metal scraper that they've expanded. And a lot of areas have gone to those, or even a vacuum and the ends of the vacuum. If they don't clean that real putrid stuff up right at the back of the curb, then we're going to have the cows do put their back feet right up against that curb when they get into the stall. So when you have more sand being used and it's wearing your whatever device you're using to clean that scrape with, even a scraper, it's going to make a difference. And so you need to be thinking about all of these things to minimize the recontamination of the relatively clean sand you put back into those stalls.
Exactly. Yep. Definitely have walked into facilities where there's a skim of manure and sand just lingering, even after a scrape, even after a back truck goes down. It just all those pieces of mechanical equipment. You're right. Like if you're bedding more frequently and there's more sand going in, that translates to more wear on equipment. So you need to take care of that, and it might not be addressing that curb the way you think it is. And 6 months could go by before you actually walk through and even see it.
Yeah, and then you change your T-tip or your liners because your mastitis level
Right.
up.
You're chasing it somewhere
Yeah,
else.
right. Instead of looking in, this is where taking that walk around your facility on a really regular basis, you just dairymen need to do more of that, frankly.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Because I mean, I will say just point blank, anytime a status goes up or we have new cases or we have higher increase in cows in hospital pens, whatever we're looking at, and we see an uptick, if they're one recycled sand, they always point, I mean, sorry, dairy producers, but you always tend to point back to sand. And so it's the bedding, it's the stall. If it is, then let's go look at it. Or we can do some tests. And I'm with you. If you start taking tests, and we've done it with several, with one dairy in particular, lots of data driven dairy, in my mind. And we have looked at, sand coming out of the back of a stall, and that's a dangerous Wild West thing to do, because it's going to be all over the place and you're not going to like it, and then you're going to freak out. And so we taking a bacterial test of sand, recycled sand, even out of the back of the stall, I'm with you. Even though it might not be as reassuring at the time, but I think the smell test is a much better place to start than going and trying to assess or analyze what's actually growing in that stall. Look, everybody's going to deal with a certain level of bacteria. I mean, even as humans, we do. So you have a level of bacteria that's going to be in that stall. In sand, hopefully it's a heck of a lot less than it is on manure solids going back in, or wet manure solids going back in, and that whole feeding frenzy. But when you look at sand, and you start analyzing it that way, I think the appearance of it, like you said before, just the how it moves with the cow. If it's moving and you got that top 6 inches or so that's like loose, that she can get in and get out pretty easily, and not a hard pan right there that she hits on top of, then I think that you're going to be okay. You're going to probably be more than okay.
yeah, spend some time going through and watching what's normal cow behavior, and not only that, but as we talked previously, what's the interaction with employees as they're bringing cows, out of that pen to the barn or the parlor. All of those things are critically important to minimizing the amount of manure splash that they get on them. And if you have a cow that gets a tremendous amount of manure splash because your people aren't skilled in stockmanship and moving cattle correctly, then that manure, when they come back to the barn, out of the parlor back to the barn and lay down, now there's organic matter caked on their udder and on their legs, which is going to seed down and it's going to grow because of the heat of the cow. So it isn't just the sand, it's the amount of manure that's on the cows from moving to and from the parlor that will contribute to the recontamination of sand in particular cows in particular stalls. So
right. Is there anything else that you'd like to add? Because we've gone through a lot of really good topics, I think, here as far as the cows and the sand and the comfort. But is there anything on the top of your mind that you want to add to this discussion on new versus recycled?
I think I just reinforced the vet test and picking up your sand and smelling it. And you say, well, that's not very scientific, Reid. And I know it isn't, but I can tell you that if you go to farms with low somatic cell counts, low clinical pull rates, and excellent production, you're going to find the sand doesn't stink like a sewer. And until you get down to that black line, and you've seen me, I incrementally dig and I'm smelling the whole way down. And I frankly think it's way better to spend your time doing that than your money sending samples away to a laboratory to look at total bacteria counts. So, I mean, it's practical, it's easy. And as I tell producers, if your clinical pen goes up all of a sudden, ask yourself, why are there more bacteria on my cow's teats when I put the units on? And then figure from there how it happened. It could be procedures in a parlor, or it could be manure splash. It could be all those things put together.
Mm-hmm. It could be a little bit of everything, but yeah, exactly. But we don't know until we look. So, and really dig in. So, well, I just want to wrap up here and thank everyone for listening to Groundwork and McClanahan Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite listening app for new episodes and follow McClanahan on social media for more content.